Okay, so welcome to the Durability of a Kennedy JFK at War, 1937 to 1945, presented by Philip Goduti. My name is Heather Marquetta, and I'm the Adult Services Director at STORS. This program is co-hosted by STORS Library and the Longmeadow Historical Society, and sponsored by Mass Humanities and the Bridge Street Fund. Before he was President of the United States, John F. Kennedy had a coming-of-age journey. In 1937, he toured Europe on the brink of war. In 1943, he reported on the United Nations peace effort in San Francisco. And in 1945, he witnessed the destructive nature of war when he visited war-torn Europe. This talk will explore JFK's experiences before his time in public office, examining primary sources written during this coming-of-age period. Philip has been an adjunct assistant professor of history at Quinnipiac University. Did I say that right?
You did.
Quinnipiac?
Yeah.
Okay. And a history teacher at Summers High School for the past 20 years. He's currently pursuing his PhD in United States history with a focus on civil rights and foreign policy post-1945. His dissertation is examining how emotion shaped John F. Kennedy's decision-making as President of the United States. He has published books and articles examining the history of civil rights and the United States foreign policy in the 50s and 60s. I would again like to thank the Longmeadow Historical Society, Mass Humanities, and the Bridge Street Fund for sponsoring this program. And welcome, Philip, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. I'd actually like to thank the Longmeadow Historical Society, the STORS Library, everyone who sponsored this event. It's really great to be a part of this. I hope I say this name right. Rebecca Fidkauskas for all of her help. Certainly, Heather, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Al McKee from the Longmeadow Historical Society, who we've had a few emails back and forth. And of course, my lifelong and very close friend, Andy Drummy, who got me in touch with the Longmeadow Historical Society to do this talk. So I'm really excited to be here tonight because tonight we get to talk about Jack. And I call him Jack because I feel like I've known him for a pretty long time. John Kennedy has been a research topic of mine for some time. My first book actually focused on John Kennedy and his foreign policy. And what I found a few years ago is that what often wasn't explored were those early years prior to him being president. And I started looking into this project about 6 or 7 years ago. So what we're going to do tonight is talk a little bit about that project. And this is my next book that I'm currently working on, which is also my dissertation. So I'm sort of doing, 2 for 1 here. And I'm hoping to get it published with my current publisher or a new one. But this is an important period in John Kennedy's life. And I think it's worth talking about. So here, what I'm going to do right now, first of all, I have on my John Kennedy election pin. I want to make sure that I came prepared. And I have Jack here with me in my bobblehead just to keep us company. But let me, I can't share the screen. So is it possible to let me? Oh, here we go. Excellent. All right, bear with me. I do this every day at work, right? So I'll play the current slide. Can everybody see this okay? All right. Well, this is the title page, all right? We'll get into why I call it the durability of a Kennedy. But first, let's talk about this whole project. So John F. Kennedy's coming of age journey begins in the 1930s and 40s. And this period shapes his core beliefs that would later inform his decision-making as President of the United States. Conventional masculine toughness, a sense of duty, determination, ambition, fortitude, and the importance of intellect really constituted the core beliefs that shaped John Kennedy and were a big part of his family and something that both Joseph Kennedy and Rose Kennedy instilled in their children. His experiences in World War II, however, challenged those core beliefs. This is my contention, and left an emotional residue, which would influence his thinking about the effectiveness of war for the rest of his life. Much of the thinking that shaped his actions as president was rooted in this conflict of core beliefs that arose from his experiences in war. So tonight we're going to go a little bit on that journey with him, but we're going to start prior to the war because Europe was on the brink of war in 1937. And in 1937, it just so happens that young Jack Kennedy was in Europe, looking at everything going on in Germany, in Paris, all over Europe. And what he found was interesting. So what we have here are some excerpts from a travel journal in 1937. John Kennedy and his close friend, Lemoyne Billings, set out for a trip to Europe, and he kept a journal. This was actually given to him by his sister, Kathleen. And he recorded his thoughts on the government. He recorded what he saw, and also his fascination with war, which really began when he was a young boy. He had been sick a lot as a kid, and he started reading a lot about World War I. In particular, he used to read Winston Churchill's volumes on World War I. With war on the horizon, he commented in July 8, 1937 that, quote, "The general feeling seems to be that there will not be another war." He went on to see scenes of the war at French Fort Pompel, which he characterized as, quote, "scenes of some of the war's worst fighting." Kennedy was intrigued by the First World War even then, and his determination to stand in the footsteps of war speaks to his fascination, even romantic notions of war, which may have been a factor in his insistence to join the military despite his health conditions. Now, while he journeyed through Europe, he also contemplated how fascism could work in those countries. And as I was going through these journals, which, by the way, are available on the John F. Kennedy website, he talked about a lot of that, and he talked about what the people thought of Roosevelt and of the United States, where he wrote that, quote, "The general impression seems to be that while they all like Roosevelt, his type of government would not succeed in a country like France, which seems to lack the ability of seeing the problem as a whole," meaning what was going on in Europe. He went out of his way to go to Chateau Thierry, which is a place where Americans fought in World War I, and actually my grandfather fought there way back when. That's on the Italian side too, right out of Boston, for the record. So, so he talked about how France, he said, quote, "France is too well prepared for Germany. The permanence of Germany and Italy is also questionable." And he basically came to the conclusion that it seemed as if war would not happen. War wasn't going to happen until 1945 or 1950. He talked a lot about what he saw in the streets, where the Italian streets are much more full and lively than those in France, seems more attractive. Fascism seems to treat them well, he wrote. The next day he saw pictures of Mussolini everywhere. How long can he last, he asked. I don't see how there can be a war till 1945, he wrote. And he said that fascism is the thing for Germany and Italy, communism for Russia, and democracy for England and the United States. So as he continued this trek, he started to truly come to some conclusions about war, about government, and the trip through Europe and his commentary demonstrates that Jack Kennedy was pondering what an effective government was, how the current state of the world would affect the future. And it's also clear that throughout the trip, the prospect of war was forefront in his mind, invading his thoughts to a point where he considered its potential. He was interested and almost obsessed with war. The more you read these journals, the more you see how much what he thought about and what he wanted to explore most were those scenes of war. So Kennedy's feelings on war and his core beliefs converged after this trip in his Harvard thesis, actually. By the way, I did forget to mention, if anyone ever has a question or anything like that, Feel free to interrupt. I'm used to it, especially being a high school teacher and being the father of three. I love questions, and it sort of breaks it up a little bit too. So any questions? So it really is a fascinating document, and I sort of stumbled on it. But if you notice, if you kind of go back here, hold on, I don't want to mess this up. There we go. If you go back, it's really tough to read his handwriting. That's something that I feel like I can get a PhD in some of it. Some of it's actually, this one's a pretty good one. Some of it, can be tough to read, but you know, in any event, some of his other stuff, it's pretty sloppy, but it's okay. What do they say about smart people? They write, sloppy, something like that. That's what my parents used to say, at least. So Kennedy's Harvard thesis, let's actually talk about this for a minute. So this is his first book. This is the one that sort of made him prior to the war, and something that his father was pretty proud of. I don't want to get too much into the thesis, though we can certainly talk a lot about it, because it has a lot to do with how he, with his relationship with his father, excuse me. Kennedy wrote to his father, in fact, that the thesis represents more work than I've ever done in my life. The month after he submitted his thesis, he met with Arthur Kroc of the New York Times, and they decided that they were going to get it published. The conclusion is a big part of who Kennedy was as a president, when you start to look at it. And he basically argued, in order for a democracy to survive, it must rearm in the face of a crisis. One of his big sayings when he was president was, "We arm to parley." We make sure that our arms are fortified. In fact, he even says it in his inaugural address. And this becomes a really important point when he's trying to develop his own foreign policy, where he wanted to have an arsenal, or he wanted to have a conventional military, but he didn't necessarily want to use it. He wanted to be diplomatic first. And he saw that as being a huge problem with Britain prior to World War I, which is a big part of this book. And the publication of this book does a lot for John Kennedy, gets him on the radio, gets him out there. And Joe Kennedy even commented that this book did a great deal of good for him. And he said that Jack had, quote, the brains and everything it takes to go somewhere. Now, Joe Kennedy Jr. was the apple of Joe Kennedy Sr.'s eye. And John Kennedy was trying to find his way in a pretty big family that was pretty competitive. When he published his book, this was a very big deal for John Kennedy, being the second oldest. So he starts to come into his own, and he starts to debate with his father, what should we do for this war? One of the cool things that I explored at the Kennedy Library were these letters between John Kennedy and Joseph Kennedy. And here are some excerpts here between the father and son, where he talks about the war. So all this is brewing in Europe, and we go to war in 1939, and in the 1940s, Kennedy was debating whether or not we should get involved. That would be John Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, who was one of the architects of Munich as ambassador to Great Britain, wanted to stay out of the war. So he was very isolationistic, as opposed to Kennedy, John Kennedy, who was an interventionist. He wrote to his father that the United States was in the same psychological pattern that England was during the year from September 1938 to September 1939. Given the argument of his book, this was a clear indictment of United States isolationistic policy, which as ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy publicly supported. John Kennedy stressed that he wanted the United States to do more in the war, not necessarily go to war. As an interventionist, he opposed his father, but he was very careful with this because he had a lot of respect for his father. He says, and if you notice, he actually, can I use my cursor? There we go. He actually underlines certain words because he wants to emphasize this to his father. We are safe. We are failing to see that if England is forced to give in by summer due to our failure to give her adequate supplies, we will have failed to meet our emergency, as did England before us. He commented on his father's perspective in this letter, saying, I realize that aid for Britain is part of your position, but in your message for America to stay out of the war, you should not do so at the expense of having people minimize aid to Britain. He concluded to his father that in the future, as we look back, we may be shocked by our lack of vigor. So I put some of those excerpts up here so you can see how he was very passionate about this. John, so if you go back to my notion of how we're looking at relationships and emotion and how all of that plays a role in the shaping of John Kennedy's core beliefs and how World War II may have challenged those core beliefs. This is an example where he was being tough, with what was going on in the world, and he was being tough against his father, which is something that his father respected. Now, Kennedy wanted to serve, but the big thing with John Kennedy, which has been written about a lot right now, especially since the biography by Robert Dallek, which came out around 2003, Kennedy was very sick. Kennedy had Addison's disease. He had been fighting that for years, to say nothing of the fact that he had colitis. He had a lot of ailments as a child. He was not fit for duty. He could not get into the Army. He tried. He was able to get into the Navy through the back door. His father helped him. His grandfather, Honey Fitz, the former mayor of Boston, also helped him get into the war. So Kennedy wanted to fight. He wanted to be a part of it. His older brother, Joe, had already been in the Navy, already a part of the war. So John wanted to do something to contribute. So he gets into the Navy. He gets in through the back door. He becomes a PT boat commander. This is after a small stint in the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he gets to the Solomon Islands in 1943, which brings us to the next phase of our journey with John Kennedy here, and that is his time at war. And this is, I see it, is the most pivotal phase. And you can see where he begins to make that transition from these core beliefs that had shaped him as a young boy moving into adulthood, that his family were so adamant about, to the actual event of PT 109 that affected that.
Hey, Phil, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Yes,
it's Mark.
Go ahead.
It's Mark, really quick. Is there any documentation of his father, Joe, after, I don't know when his father died, but after when Pearl Harbor was bombed, did he change his sort of isolationist rhetoric, if you will? Do you know that? Great
question. That, I don't know. That's a really good question. I know by that point, he was pushed out of the Roosevelt White House by then. And I don't know, I'd have to look at that. That's actually an interesting avenue to explore, because I'm more familiar with his speeches prior to Pearl Harbor than I am with his speeches after Pearl Harbor, because he was a strong isolationist prior to Pearl Harbor. And I think out of political expedience, he probably did not speak out against going to war, but I'd like to check that out. That's a really good question. So I don't have the answer, unfortunately, but I will look into it. Now, as we move into the war, I looked at a lot of his letters home and letters to his friend Lemoyne Billings and his romantic interest, Inga Arver. So those letters in particular demonstrate how Kennedy saw war prior to the PT 109 incident. For example, in his letter to Lemoyne Billings, when he first got there, he wrote saying how he entered the Navy and arrived in the Solomons on April 7th, 1943. And in the midst of the battle on that day, a Japanese airman had parachuted into the water and started shooting at Kennedy's ship with a revolver as the men tried to help him aboard with a rope. Kennedy wrote to Lemoyne Billings, "We returned with everything we had, the water boiling around him, but everyone was too surprised to shoot straight." He said that an old soldier standing next to me picked up his rifle, fired once, and blew the top of the Japanese airman's head off. He threw his arm forward and sank. He commented to Billings, "It brought home very strongly how long it is going to take to finish this war." So there was this very violent episode when he first gets there, and he witnesses war firsthand very, very quickly. To his family, however, he wrote something a little different. And there's a little bit of a contrast, and this is just maybe a few weeks later. He wrote that it was beautiful when he was on patrol. Quote, "The water is amazingly phosphorescent. Flying fishes which shine like lights are zooming around, and you usually get 2 or 3 porpoises who lodge right under the bow." He did express some frustration with his fellow soldiers, saying, quote, "No one out here has the slightest interest in politics. They just want to get home morning, noon, and night," and demonstrating a nationalistic zeal in these letters. He wrote, "Our stuff is better. Our pilots and planes are, everything considered, way ahead of theirs, and resources inexhaustible." So you see in the letter home to his family, he's putting up this front where he believes it's right to be there, where he's going to be fine. And his family was very worried about him given his health issues. So he also wanted to put up the front that I'm fine. I'm out on patrol. It's great. Inga Arvard, however, he had a little different tone where he said, "I understand we are winning it, which is cheering, albeit hard to see. But I guess the view improves with distance. I know mine would." He said, "I wouldn't mind being back in the States, picking up a daily paper, saying, why don't these bastards do something," he wrote. He said that to Inga Arvard, "I hear you saying, I asked for it, honey, and I'm getting it." He wanted to be home. He wanted to be with her. He finished his letter, however, saying that he was glad that he had come to war and wouldn't miss it for the world. Which is a direct assertion of his own manhood. So he was trying to put up a little bit of a front with her as well. So these 3 letters, which, these are just short little excerpts out of them. These 3 letters illustrate how Kennedy expressed his experience in war to different people, as well as the varied emotions that he was feeling during those periods. The letter to Billings is focused on how he and his men on his boat killed a Japanese soldier, acknowledging the brutality of war and the necessity to wage a long struggle. To his family, however, he talked more about the beauty of the ocean landscape and how some soldiers lacked the drive to fight as he did. To Arvard, it shows the beginning of a young man questioning the war effort and longing to be with her. Taken together, these letters are evidence of strong emotions, ranging from doubt to fear to love, and embodied elements of that sense of duty and toughness that were a part of his core beliefs. They also demonstrate that the audience of his correspondence played a part in the meaning of his words. In the case of his family, those letters were meant to live up to the standard established by that Kennedy family. However, to Billings and Arvard, they're revealing of Kennedy's feelings of doubt about the war. So you see a little bit of doubt, but you don't see as much as you see after PT 109. So PT 109 happens in August 1943. It's a pretty famous story, and I have the coconut there, which I tell my students about the coconut and about how do I have control of I'm going to admit someone here if that's okay. Here we go. How he used that coconut to signal where they were. So in August 1943, his PT-109 boat was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. This proved a turning point for Kennedy. The New York Times reported Kennedy as saying, "It all happened so fast, there wasn't a chance to do a thing." The piece featured his actions as well as those of Pat McMahon, the engineer of the boat who suffered major burns. Kennedy swam to an island while pulling McMahon with the strap from McMahon's life vest between his teeth. It's a pretty amazing story. The surviving crew found refuge on the nearby islands, hiding from the Japanese and eventually sending a message etched on the famous coconut, which I brought some of my students from Quinnipiac to the Kennedy Library, and that's one of the first things we saw. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for rescuing the lives of his crew. He would say that, when people asked him how he became a war hero, he said it was involuntary. They sank my boat. So he really had no choice. What we see after PT 109 is a little different. In August, just after that, recuperating in Tulagi, Kennedy writes home to his family, "A short note to tell you that I am alive and not kicking." Always trying to present a good front. He said that they misjudged the durability of a Kennedy. A lot of people reported him dead. In fact, his father thought he was dead for some time. He knew that he was missing, and he kept it from his mother. He was reflective in another letter home on September 12th, demonstrating a clear change in how he expressed war to his family. He said, certainly that the PT-109 episode certainly brought home how real the war is. When I read that we will fight the Japanese for years if necessary, and will sacrifice hundreds of thousands if we must, I always like to check from where he is talking. It's seldom out here. The letter suggested that the normalization of war talk and the fact that some leaders were willing to send unending numbers of soldiers off to die bothered Kennedy. He wrote that people talk, quote, about so many billions of dollars and millions of soldiers that thousands of dead sound like a drop in the bucket. Referring to the men in PT-109, Kennedy wrote, if those thousands want to live as much as the 10 I saw, they would measure their words with great, great care. Excuse me. To Arvid, he wrote, he wrote, the people deciding the whys and the wherefores had better make mighty sure that all this effort is headed for some definite goal. And he concluded, this thing is so stupid that while it has a sickening fascination for some of us, myself included, I want to leave it far behind when I go. This is where you start seeing him become disillusioned with war, where war wasn't what it was back in 1937 when he was going to Chateau Thierry, or he was looking at some of those sites where the great battles happened, as he wrote about back then. These three examples of correspondence to his family and Arvid after the episode are evidence in a shift of attitude. He had arisen, so in this short note just after the incident, Kennedy asserted his familial bond that being a Kennedy was exceptional. They misjudged the durability of a Kennedy. He had risen to the occasion and prevailed over a near-death situation. This was his attempt to demonstrate his determination to keep fighting and uphold those Kennedy values. However, in that September letter to his family, he was tired of people talking about war. He characterized his experience and attitude of the men under his command as exceptional, creating a clear division between the people at home and those who served in combat. And we see that again later with the newspaper articles that I'm going to get into. He continued that expression of loss and cynical view of war in his letter to Arvid, writing that the whole experience made him ill. Jack Kennedy was willing to articulate feelings not in line with the sense of duty that he was taught in the wake of this episode. This is a significant divergence that points to an evolution in his thinking about war and his core beliefs as they related to the Kennedy family and how that played a pervasive role in his life. So this is the big moment right here. And from here, you start to see a difference in this correspondence. Questions, anything, interrupt me, please. I'm Italian, so we just keep talking. We don't like silences.
What does the coconut say?
The coconut basically says, hold on, let me move this out of the way. Oh, you can't really tell. The coconut basically says, it gives them the coordinates of where they are, and it puts his name on there, basically, and where to pick him up. And a native of the island where he was took the coconut to a British base. So it was the British that actually came in and saved him and his crew. But they figured out where he was based on that coconut. So what Kennedy did is he saved that coconut and he had it made into a paperweight. And that paperweight was on the desk of the Oval Office while he was president. And if you go into the Kennedy Library, before you go into the main movie, usually when you go in there, you watch a movie first. You can go and see the coconut and his medal that he received in World War II. It's pretty cool. And when I tell the story to the students, I remember being a kid, being a Catholic, being raised in New England, going to Cape Cod every summer. I remember hearing about this coconut all the time from my grandparents, and just about how he did all this stuff. And we were always looking for Kennedys when we were at Cape Cod. So I sort of grew up in that atmosphere. So I remember hearing this story when I was a kid. And I guess that sort of left a mark on me as I went into my own studies. So I found it fascinating that he actually saved these men with the shell of a coconut.
So roughly how long was Kennedy on that island? Do you know offhand?
I think it's 4 days. I think it was either 4 or 5 days. So they started a couple of them got really sick because they didn't have any water. But he actually, and you know, that's a whole other talk. It's such an interesting story. He actually took a boat. So first he went and he tried to swim to try to get a patrol boat. So he put on a life vest and was out there, and he's looking for a patrol boat, This is after he swam with the guy's strap in his mouth. And he passed out because he was so exhausted, and he drifted back on the shore. The next day, when they saw that they needed food and there was nothing on the island where they were, he swam to another island and walked along the coral to where there was a Japanese encampment, and he found some water and food and a small canoe. And then he took that stuff in the canoe and brought it back over to the men, and then they went to a different island because they were afraid that the Japanese were going to discover them. And he was able to give them some food, but when he went on the coral, he scratched up his feet to the point where the next day it started to get inflamed from infection. Then the next day he took the canoe out to try to go to another island, and he got caught up in the surf and ended up on a different island where he ran into to the native. And that's when he's like, listen, I need you to go to a British base. And he put the coordinates on the coconut, gave it to him. And it was the next morning when they actually came to save him. He lost 2 people in the initial explosion. And he himself, who was actually in the front, was thrown across the boat. And he literally witnessed the hull of the Japanese destroyer go right by his face as he was sitting there. And he thought to himself, this must be how it feels to die, because he thought he was going to die in that second. John Hersey interviewed him just after it and wrote an article in the New Yorker about it. And actually, Joe Kennedy printed up copies of that and sent it out for his first election. And he made sure that everyone had a copy of this story, which really was extraordinary. And I think we forget about that sometimes about John Kennedy, that he had this whole other life with, you know, World War II. And he's the other thing that attracted me to this project is that John Kennedy is one of the few modern presidents that actually experienced combat, like close combat. And actually, the other one is George Herbert Walker Bush. So, you know, George Bush the first was actually, you know, shot down, as opposed to, and so he and, you know, Kennedy both served in World War II. Obviously, Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied commander, but he saw it from a different perspective. So Kennedy, he had a certain perspective when it came to war that other people did not. So, all right, so
I'm curious.
Oh, yeah, please.
I have a question real quick. I'm sorry.
No.
At this time, did Kennedy and the people that he was fighting with, the other soldiers, did they know what the war was about? Did they know what was happening to the Jews in Germany at this time?
That's a really great question. And they did not. They did not. But when he went through, and I don't have that excerpt, I mean, I wasn't going to share that excerpt with you tonight, but he does comment on that in his post-war journal, because he comments on the SS, and it was just coming out in 1945 as we liberated those camps. He actually compared the SS to the Russians when he was in Europe, because he saw how the Russians occupied Berlin, and what happened in Berlin after, you know, after the Russians had taken the city. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but he didn't know about the concentration camps yet. And he really starts to learn about that in 45 and 46.
And I just want to say one other thing. Looks like we're having a bit of a storm here. So if the power goes out, are you able to run things from your end, Philip?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I can be okay. Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, we do this all the time at work. So yeah. All right. Any other questions? These are great, by the way. They're awesome. All right. Let's talk about how am I doing on time? Yeesh. Okay. All right. Sorry, guys. Let's talk about Joe for a minute. All right. Sorry. Bear with me. Here we go. All right. So this is actually a letter between Joe Kennedy and John Kennedy. And one of the things that Joe said this is, Joe Jr., is he sort of gave him a hard time about, PT-1. What I really want to know is, where the hell were you when the destroyer hove in the sight? He, really gave him some, and this was consistent with how these two got along. The larger work that I'm doing explores the relationship between these two brothers. And it really was an interesting relationship. And Joe Kennedy was very competitive with this, with this medal that his little brother just got. My congrats on the medal. To get anything out of the Navy is deserving of a campaign medal in itself. It looks like I shall return home with a European medal if I'm lucky. Now, this letter was postmarked August 12, 1945, the day that Joe died in the bombing. So he sent this letter home, and this was probably the last letter that he sent home. Joe's death has a profound impact on John Kennedy, a profound impact, not only because of what you often hear, oh, well, Joe Kennedy died and John Kennedy was going to take over. There's some truth in that, but the other piece of it is he had a strong relationship with his brother and looked up to his brother. And you see that especially in a book that he edited for his brother, As We Remember Joe. So this is a book that the John Kennedy Library sent me excerpts, so it's not great quality. But he actually had a copy of this on his desk in the Oval Office. It's something that he kept close, something that he often looked to. He said of his brother that Joe left a lasting mark on the hearts of an extraordinarily large number of people. And I sincerely think that all of the people I have ever met, Joe had truly the mark of greatness in him. He looked up to his brother, despite what you hear about the constant competition. And this really affected him to the point where where this is just another piece of how the war was now changing his attitude about war, because he lost someone who was very close to him. So while he wrote about him here, and I was going to give you a little more, but we're running out of time. He also wrote about his brother to his high school English teacher, Harold Tinker. Now, this is an interesting letter that I found over at Brown University. And he talks to Tinker about Joe, where he says, Joe's death was naturally a shock. He had developed his capabilities to an extraordinary degree since leaving Choate, and I've always felt that he could have reached whatever goal his ambition set. Now, the big one from this letter that I took, and he talks a lot about his brother, is this line right here. And he's just speaking to Harold Tinker, saying, "This war makes less sense to me now than it ever made, and that was little enough. And I should really like as my life's goal, in some way and at some time, to do something to help prevent another." Now, this is while he's recuperating from back surgery, because after the war, he was very, very ill. And he needed to do a couple different surgeries on his back, largely because of the PT-109 episode, but also because of lifelong issues that he's had with his back and the treatment that he had from Addison's disease. They used steroids back then, and steroids just slowly deteriorates the bones, and it really affected his back. And arguably, that may have also contributed to his death, because the day that he was assassinated, he was wearing a back brace. And after that first shot, he couldn't duck or get down, and the back brace limited his ability to move. And some historians argue that it was actually that kept him up long enough where he ended up getting shot. So this was an ailment that had really bothered him for the majority of his life. The dynamics in the Kennedy family after Joe's death were irrevocably altered. And the loss of Joe heightened the emotions he experienced after the war and intensified the impact of that emotional residue that I talked about earlier, leading him to a greater conflict with those core beliefs that had been instilled within him. So you start to see this even in some of his public stuff as well, not only in his private. One of the other cool things about John Kennedy that really remain unexplored are the articles that he wrote for the Journal American while covering the UN conference in 1945. The byline was Lieutenant John F. Kennedy recently retired PT boat hero of the South Pacific and son of former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. And he was covering this from the serviceman's point of view. He talked a lot about the Russians, and I was going to spend some time on that, but let's get into this other piece instead. In a May 7th, 1945 article, Kennedy wrote that about the veterans. No one can set himself up as a spokesman for the men in service, he wrote. To come from the battlefields where sacrifice is the order of the day, to come from there to here, is not surprising that they should question the worth of their sacrifice and feel somewhat betrayed. He said that these veterans wanted to spare their children and their brothers from going through the same hard time, and that it was, quote, natural that the vets were disappointed with the peace process at San Francisco. He was not happy with the UN peace conference, and he writes a lot about this, not only in the newspaper, but also in his own journals. In addition to that, there's this piece down here that I discovered at the Kennedy Library when he sent this article in. This piece, for whatever reason, was edited out. He wrote, speaking of those veterans, as many of them have seen heavy combat and have suffered grievous wounds, I feel that they are qualified to speak. And these grievous wounds implies the emotional and physical pains that they all shared, including him. So not only was he talking about grievous wounds that he endured in battle, but also the grievous wounds that he felt with the loss of his brother. He also said in that article, the world organization that will come out of San Francisco will be the product of the same passions and selfishness that produced the Treaty of Versailles, which from his perspective, and at that time, the Treaty of Versailles was not seen as a successful document because it arguably led to World War II, because it was not successful in containing the peace after World War I. So Kennedy left the conference feeling that this isn't good, and he wanted there to be peace. In fact, he wrote, I don't have excerpts of this. In fact, I'm looking for a copy of it. He wrote an article that he wanted to publish in the Atlantic about how the world could attain peace, how they could find a peaceful way. And this is right around the time of the Cold War beginning. So he saw the writing on the wall with what was going on in Eastern Europe. And he had also toured Europe after World War II. And this is where we're coming to the closing here. Kennedy's writings after the war were not only the newspaper articles. Joe Kennedy Sr. arranged for Jack to travel to Europe with Secretary of Navy James Forrestal. And this is in mid-July 1945 to the beginning of August. As he was coming in from the air, he wrote in the journal that Germany's landscape said that the small towns and fields looked peaceful, but in larger cities like Frankfurt, and the buildings are merely of the sods. He described the centers of these cities as an ash gray color and churned up in powdered stone and brick. Excuse me, words are hard. So these types of descriptions that involve specific colors are not seen in any other writings of Kennedy's. He's using very stark imagery to describe the aftermath of war. He spoke a lot about the Russians. He wrote a lot about the Russians in the Journal American, and he writes about them here too, which I find fascinating because he dealt directly with Khrushchev when he was president. And this is something that became a big part of his presidency. And so you start to see how he saw the Russians. He spoke about them in the articles about how Molotov basically controlled everything. And there was almost a level of respect for Molotov, as if, wow, look at him. He's actually outbesting some of who are considered the best diplomats. And here he says, after landing, Forrestal and Kennedy drove immediately to Potsdam through miles of Russian soldiers, he wrote. He was impressed with the Russians. He said, quote, they looked rugged and tough, unsmiling, but with perfect discipline. As the cars drove by, they presented their arms. He also wrote that one opinion here is that the Russians are never going to pull out of their zone of occupation, which ends up happening, of course, but plan to make their part of Germany a Soviet Socialist Republic, which is also something that ends up happening. He also understood, he wrote, quote, that if we pull out, we may leave a political vacuum that the Russians will be only too glad to fill. The Berlin Wall went up under his presidency, and he refused to leave Berlin. And he gives that Berlin speech, which is one of his greatest speeches as president. He understood that the United States needed a presence in Berlin as early as 1945, which I see as an interesting way to look at his presidency, because he was there when the occupation started. Now, speaking of Berlin, his description of Berlin in this journal, he said that the streets of Berlin were sweet and sickish from dead bodies, and he painted a very vivid picture using color and imagery. Not only was he consumed with what was going on there and what he saw, but he reflected as he watched people in Berlin. He said that they looked completely, he said, quote, completely colorless faces, a yellow tinge with pale lips. And he said that where they are going, no one seems to know. I wonder whether they do. And those descriptions, the imagery, the emotions he was writing about, were his first impressions of the aftermath of war. He had witnessed battles and experienced death in the Pacific, but he had not seen cities reduced to rubble and people displaced as a result of war until he went through Europe. And I would argue that this had a huge impact on him, because as he contemplated war with the Russians in 1962 and invading Cuba, I think he understood what could happen to the United States because he saw what happened to Germany, which in 1937 he toured, and it was this great, great metropolis. And when he saw it in 1945, it was reduced to rubble. So it sort of bookends this whole journey that he had, seeing Europe prior to the war and seeing Europe after the war in the same footsteps that he had done before. The other interesting thing, and I'll end with this, was he went into the Reich Chancellery, which is where Hitler and the Germans ran the war. And he saw how the walls were chipped and scarred with bullets. It was well furnished, but completely devastated, he said. The room where Hitler was supposed to have met his death showed scorched walls and traces of fire. I find it interesting that Kennedy went into Berlin and went to Eagle's Nest, went to the Reich Chancellery, met with Dwight Eisenhower, and he said of Dwight Eisenhower that he never lost that humble way and therefore easily won the hearts of those whom he worked. It was obvious why he is an outstanding figure. He was an easy personality, immense self-assurance, and gave an excellent presentation of the situation in Germany. Kennedy called Eisenhower all the time when he was president to look for guidance. He had a lot of respect for Eisenhower. And Potsdam happens to be, it's one of the few times in history where you have a current president and then the next two succeeding presidents in one place at the same time. The Second Continental Congress, I think, is one of the only times where you see that happening, where they weren't in elective office, and, you know, with the exception of Truman, of course. Kennedy's diary, and I'm just giving you a small portion of it, is a testament to his own intimate experiences of the destructive nature of war. And I feel like that was the final piece that brought him into his own belief that he wanted to avoid war at all costs. The irony of the whole thing, of course, is when he runs for office in 1946 for the Congress, he runs on his war record. They give PT 109 pins. I've actually, one of our secretaries at Summers High School, her aunt used to work for Kenny O'Donnell, who was a close aide to President Kennedy, and she brought in some of the stuff. And one of the things was that PT 109 tie clip, which is actually pretty cool. So he runs for Congress on that, but the record that I've been exploring demonstrates that while Kennedy in the past may have been seen as a Cold Warrior, may have been seen as someone who wanted to confront the Russians, I think, in fact, it demonstrates a person who understood the Russians very well and wanted to do whatever it took to get some level of peace within the world. And he wanted to be a part of that peace, which is why he took such a big role in his foreign policy. And a lot of historians see him as his own Secretary of State. So I believe that this moment in time, these years, shaped John Kennedy to make decisions as president to stave off war. Thank you all very much for letting me share some of my fun relics on John Kennedy. So, I'd like
Thank
to.
you very much, Phil.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, any questions? Sorry, I went over the 45 minutes.
Okay. If people would like to unmute now to ask questions, please feel free.
That was great, Phil. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you again for having me, really.
Does anyone have any questions?
So remind me, he ran for Senate when?
1952. So he was in Congress, 46 he ran. So he served in Congress from 47 to 43. Excuse me, 53. And then he served in the Senate from 53 to 61.
So Phil, he was able to, he ended up joining the Navy, right?
Yeah.
So he wanted to get into the Army though? I didn't realize
Yeah,
that.
he did. He actually wanted to get in the Army. I don't think he wanted to be in the same branch as his brother. And so he tried for the Army, and the Army just kept denying him. So he figured out a back way in, and he got into the Office of Naval Intelligence. And then he didn't want to stay at the desk job. And actually, Joe Kennedy wanted to keep him away from Inga Arvard, who was in the same place. So he had his son transferred. And then his son went to his grandfather and said, I want to get into the, PT boats. Because the PT boats at the time were known for taking General MacArthur from the Philippines over to Australia. So they were in the news at the time as being this really cool thing. So he wanted to be in a, PT boat. So he really pushed hard for that. And he actually trained over in Rhode Island at a school there. And then from there, he got shipped over to the Solomons.
Any more questions?
So we were
Yeah.
remarking about how thin he looked in those photos.
Yeah, so that was in 46, 45 and 46. Kennedy was very, very ill. The back surgery that he had done really took a toll on him. And one of his friends actually went to see him. He was jaundice. And he lost a ton of weight. I don't think it was Billings. It was one of his war buddies. And during the election of 46, so he's supposed to be demonstrating this, young, vigorous, new generation. And he had a difficult time going up and down stairs when he was campaigning. And I think it was, what's his name? One of the main people who actually his name, it's not Kenny O'Donnell, it was oh darn it. Anyway, he went from door to door with him, and he actually commented like, I've never seen somebody so determined, and he just went one step at a time. Like, he didn't walk upstairs how normal people walked upstairs. And at the very last campaign event, he actually collapsed. It was a parade. And they sort of whisked him away in the back. And there's this picture of him when he wins that night. And let me see if I can find it. And he just looks horrible. He looks like he's wearing his father's suit. And he was a very sick person. And I think a lot of times we forget that, because when he comes into office, he does not look sick. But he was also very sick in office too. Which led to a lot of controversial medicine while he was the president that actually Robert Dallek wrote about.
So this is, a seminal event, but we're old enough to remember hearing about the assassination. Most of you were probably too young. Like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or whatever the generation's seminal event was. I do remember.
Do you remember where you were, Betsy?
I was in the second grade, first grade. Yeah. We got sent home from school, and I found my mother watching television in the middle of the day, which was very odd. And everybody was very sad. That's what I remember.
When we take students, Andy, Mark, and I take students to DC. We haven't been able to do it because of the pandemic. One of the exhibits at the Smithsonian has a lot of the signage and a lot of the things that were actually up when Kennedy was assassinated. And there's these signs that say basically the country's closed for 3 days. So they shut down everything, I guess, for I think it was 4. Actually, I think it was 4 days for the funeral and for everything, because it took 4 days total, which in my last book, I actually spent a little bit of time. I don't really normally talk about the assassination because I don't get into a lot of the different conspiracies and so forth, but I wanted to look at the event itself, how it affected the nation. And I watched the funeral procession of Kennedy. So I watched the whole thing from beginning to end a few times, and it really was extraordinary what they did and how they did, and how Jackie Kennedy, she was in charge of everything. Her and to some extent Bobby were in charge of the whole thing, and she's the one who wanted him buried at Arlington. The family wanted him up in Boston, or at Cape. I think it was Cape Cod. She wanted him at Arlington because she wanted him among the soldiers, among the troops who he actually served with. And it was her idea to do the eternal flame because it was something that she saw in France. So she came up with all of that, and it's really fascinating. There's a great book on it. I think it's called The Afterlife of John F. Kennedy, and it talks a lot about how she created this notion of Camelot and this whole myth behind the Kennedy presidency, because it was never called Camelot until she gave an interview with Theodore White, and she started to talk about it in those terms. And it's really fascinating when you see how she did this whole, she basically created this funeral for the world to see, and it really set the tone for the meaning of his death.
That's interesting. It almost sounds like the tone of his presidency wasn't there until after he passed away.
Yeah. And you can even argue the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was stalled in Congress and is seen as one of Johnson's great achievements. He passed that largely by using the death of Kennedy as something that he wanted to do. And he even mentioned in his first speech that the first thing we're going to do as a Congress is pass this civil rights bill that Kennedy so long fought for. And so the Civil Rights Act of 64, which the Democrats wanted to stay away from it because they had a lot of segregationists in the South, and they didn't want any part of it. Johnson got it passed, but it was largely on Kennedy's coattails, which is why Bobby Kennedy would often say that was President Kennedy's Civil Rights Act. It was not Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act. And Johnson signed the bill with Kennedy's pens. So he didn't use his own pens until he got elected in his own right in 1964. So yeah, you're right, because his presidency took on even greater meaning in the wake of his death, I think. And part of that was because of Jackie, and also to some extent, I don't think Bobby would want to hear this, to some extent, Lyndon Johnson. Bobby and Johnson did not get along. It is a historic, epic feud between the two of them.
Hey, Phil, I think I remember you telling me this before. How big of a deal did Kennedy's political opponents, Nixon, make of his Catholicism? Was it a big thing?
It was a big thing.
I think it was, yeah.
It was a huge thing. In fact, so much so that he had to give a speech about being Catholic and about how he wouldn't take orders from the Pope. It's something that he felt he needed to put to rest. He didn't deal with it in the primaries, although when he won the West Virginia primary, because there was such a very high Protestant population there, a lot of people thought that the Catholic issue, that's what they called it, really didn't matter because he had such a strong showing. But then when he went up against Richard Nixon in a general, it seemed to be a huge issue, and it kept coming up. So he actually just confronted it in a speech before the news, and just said, look, I'm the president. If I get elected, I'm the president of the United States who happens to be Catholic. I'm not the Catholic president of the United States that's going to listen to the Pope. So he had to put it to rest. That and his age, which is ironic because, Nixon wasn't that much older than him, but he had to qualify that too during the debates. You see him actually talk about his experience because, Nixon had been, vice president, and he allegedly had a little more experience than, Kennedy, having only been in the Senate. So it is interesting to see how he was really behind the 8 ball, and it really was not a given that he was going to win that election. It's one of the closest elections in history. There's only 120,000 vote difference in the popular between Nixon and Kennedy, and so it could have went either way.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, great. Wonderful talk, filled with terrific bits of wonderful story. But as a Vietnam vet, I'm interested in Kennedy's abhorrence of war and our entry into Vietnam, which really began in his term. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I do, actually. This is something I want to talk a lot about in this project. There's a great historian, Frederick Logeval, who's written about Vietnam. And what was the name of that book? I'm looking at my bookshelf. He talks about Kennedy. And actually, Frederick Logeval and I have actually, he just recently wrote a book on Kennedy. I think it's just called Kennedy. And it does look at this period that I'm exploring right now. And his contention is that Kennedy was never going to get involved in Vietnam, that he was just delaying it, that he just didn't want to make a decision, much like actually Eisenhower before him.
Definitely.
And he was continuing with that policy. And his contention would be that Kennedy would not have got into Vietnam to the same extent that Johnson did, because he didn't see us winning there. And on numerous occasions, he said that this isn't a US issue, this is a South Vietnam issue. And they need to fight the war and they need to win it. And he gave that interview with Walter Cronkite. I want to say it was in '63. I want to say it was not too long before the assassination, where he says it publicly. Look, this is their war. They have to fight it. They have to win it. So it's really tough. It's always tough to say what would he have done. But I think Logeval gives a really good explanation when he says that, Kennedy would have just kept doing the same thing, because it's not that he didn't ignore Vietnam. He sent actually Robert McNamara and, Taylor over there to look at the situation. But both McNamara and Taylor basically said, at first they said, we need to ratchet it up. And then they suddenly took a huge 180-degree turn and said, no, actually, we don't need to do that. And they actually sent an update to the report and said, we need to try to, stay out of there. And so you see Kennedy beginning to think about withdrawing. And certainly, you can argue that the assassination of Dim just before his assassination may have contributed to those feelings, because he saw that, there was a level of unrest there that we just can't seem to control. I think that might have been, so it would have been interesting to see how he responded to that and what he would have done, say in December and in, January, going into an election year, how he would have handled a lot of what was going on in South Vietnam. But unfortunately, he was assassinated in the same month, and we'll never know. But personally, I don't think he would have went into Vietnam the way that Johnson did. Johnson,
No.
went,
because he had the experience and Johnson did not.
Right. And that's exactly what I'm going to argue. That's where I'm going with this argument, where, you know, Johnson did not have that. He didn't see heavy combat. He didn't suffer grievous wounds the same as Kennedy did back in 43. So he doesn't understand war from that perspective. He understood it from the perspective of, you know, for lack of a better term, of like an administrator of war, just sort of, you know, governing it from a distance. Which, by the way, most of it. So the other piece is people argue, well, the same people who were advising Kennedy advised Johnson. And I would say, no, that's not entirely true, because there was one person who was not in that room that was always in the room with John Kennedy, and he always listened to, and that was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was not a part of the decision-making going into Vietnam. He was still Attorney General. He left the office just after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So he left the office in August 1964, went on to run for the Senate in that year. So Bobby wasn't a part of Johnson's inner circle, and John Kennedy had him involved in everything after the Bay of Pigs. So the fact that those two were not in the room, not making, you know, and were confronted with the same situation, tells me that it's not the same advisors. You know, there were a few of the same advisors, all of which did not experience war the same way that John Kennedy did, though they did participate in World War II, but more from a distance, whether it be McNamara, Bundy. They all were at World War II, but it was from a distance. Even Maxwell Taylor, he's probably the closest, because he was in France, and it was in charge of the 101st. But the rest of them, no. That's a good question. Thanks. It's fun to discuss that, because I do think it's important to really try to understand that.
It's incredibly ironic that someone who had such a nuanced picture of what happened in a war should have been at the bottom stage of this incredible ramp up that led to disaster.
Right.
Any more questions? Anyone? All right.
Well, this was truly a pleasure. Thank you all so very much. I love to talk about this stuff, and my kids won't listen to me. So it's you know, nice to actually have a conversation about, you know, John Kennedy and get these great questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this.
Well, it was great having you, Phil. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to thank again the Longmeadow Historical Society, Mass Humanities, and the Bridge Street Fund for sponsoring this program. So thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Good night. Thank you.
Take care. Stay dry.